Greetings everyone, and today I'll be reviewing the living daylights out of a brand new Sigma lens designed for mirrorless cameras with a smaller APS-C sized sensor, the 18-50mm f2.8 DC-DN. It will be for Sony E-mount and also L-mount cameras and will cost only £430 in the UK. That is a fantastically low price for a bright aperture zoom lens like this. The price in US dollars will be in the description below. I'd like to thank Sigma for loaning me this lens for a week or two for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. That basic but nonetheless useful zoom range of 18-50mm or 28-75mm in full frame terms, combined with a bright maximum aperture of f2.8, makes this a fast standard zoom lens, one of the most challenging ones out there for manufacturers to design, while also being one of the most enjoyable and useful for photographers to actually get out and use. You wouldn't guess that this is an f2.8 lens though from its tiny size. Just look at it, it's about the same size as a zoomable kit lens with a much darker aperture. The first fast standard zoom lens I ever owned was this old f2.8 monster for Canon's APS-C digital SLR cameras, which is well over twice as big and heavy as this new Sigma option, not to mention much more expensive. So it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to guess that Sigma's design priority was a compact size here, and have clearly succeeded. We'll see in a minute how that might or might not affect its image quality. Something to mention early on is that this lens does not have its own image stabilization, a slightly risky decision by Sigma, as not all of Sony's smaller cameras are image stabilized, although the newer ones are all going that way now. And for anyone who's curious, here's what the lens's image looks like on a full frame camera. As you can see, the image fits quite tightly around the APS-C image area. Let's start by looking at build quality. The main body of the lens is made of plastic, and at under 300 grams it's not very heavy, but it does feel very solid and tightly assembled without any wobbling or shaky parts. The lens mount is made of metal with a weather sealing gasket around the edge. The lens does not have an auto manual focus switch, but you do get this plastic focus ring, which turns quite smoothly and works responsively with the focus motor. Some good news for video makers is that, whether you're zoomed in or out, we see almost no focus breathing with this lens. Here's the autofocus motor in action. This footage was taken in relatively low light. Even then, the focus motor is silent, accurate, and relatively quick. So again, that's very good for video work. Next on the lens's body comes the zoom ring, which is rubberized and turns extremely smoothly, being very well damped and not encountering any stickiness. Again, that is excellent news for video makers. The lens is not parfocal. If you zoom in and out quickly, then you can see a temporary loss of focus, but even in manual focus mode, it almost instantly readjusts itself to focus on the right point again as you change focal length, so you never really notice. The lens comes with the usual caps and a nice quality little plastic hood with a little rubber trimming to it, and its filter size is a small 55mm. It doesn't come with a carry case or bag. So, while the lens doesn't have image stabilization, it does however cover every other base with good build quality, excellent autofocus, low focus breathing. It could be an especially nice option for video making. Now let's see about image quality. I'll be testing this lens on my Sony APS-C camera, a little 24MP a5100. In-camera corrections are turned on for this test. At the widest angle of 18mm and f2.8, we see perfect resolution and contrast in the middle of the image. The corner image quality looks a little soft though. Stop down to f4 for a little improvement, and at f5.6 they now look sharp. They stay this sharp down to about f11, although if you stop down to f16, unsurprisingly, the whole image begins to soften due to the unavoidable effects of diffraction. Let's zoom in a bit now to 28mm. At f2.8, again, the middle of the image sees absolutely razor-sharp image quality. Over in the corners again, we see some softness. At f4 they look just as soft, but at f5.6 there is a small improvement. At f8 and f11 the corners look nice and sharp now. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 50mm. At f2.8 the middle of the image looks excellent, although not quite as razor sharp as at wider angles. The corners at f2.8 also look a bit softer than they did at wider angles. f4 and f5.6 look about the same in the corners, although I can tell you that the middle quickly becomes razor sharp again. Stop down to f8 or f11 and those corners finally sharpen up. So it's a pretty simple conclusion from all these tests. The lens is always fantastically sharp in the middle of your images with good contrast and low chromatic aberration, but the image corners are softer at brighter apertures. Other fast standard zoom lenses can get a little sharper than this, but if you dramatically scale down a lens's size, then there will always be an optical downside somewhere. Anyway, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting if we turn off the in-camera corrections. At 18mm and f2.8, we see some pretty wild barrel distortion and very strong vignetting in the corners. Stop down to f4, f5.6 and f8 for those corners to brighten up. Zoom into 25mm and the distortion flips into a slight pincushion pattern, and at 50mm that too becomes very strong, and again with dark corners at f2.8. Again though, at f4, f5.6 and f8, the corners brighten up a lot. So we encounter some major problems there. Be sure to keep those in-camera corrections firmly turned on. Now then, close-up image quality, and Sigma advertised that as a strong point in this lens's design. Zoom all the way into 50mm and you can focus much closer than average, which is lots of fun. Less encouraging is the very poor close-up image quality at f2.8, however at f4 and f5.6 sharpness and contrast greatly increase, and at f8 any visible chromatic aberration disappears, leaving behind perfect picture quality. So that's what happens when you zoom in, but if you zoom the lens out, you can get even closer to your subject, dramatically so. In fact, here my baby camera clock is only millimeters away from the front of the lens, casting it into the lens's shadow. What an image though. At that brighter angle, the close-up image quality is now brilliantly sharp, even straight from f2.8, so you have some interesting options for shooting smaller subjects here. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. At wide angles, an average amount of flaring can be seen here, but it's nothing especially bothersome. Zoom in, and if bright lights are directly in your picture, you lose a bit more contrast. Let's take a look at this lens's bokeh. Deeply out of focus backgrounds look quite nice here. In the middle distance, however, we can see a little busyness and some longitudinal chromatic aberration. Look at those blue outlines on strong highlights in this picture. Well, let's look a little closer at longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f2.8, as you can see, it's extremely strong. Stop down to f4, f5.6 and f8, and it slowly goes away. Overall, this was an interesting lens for me to test out, as it does offer something a bit different. A fast standard zoom lens that's this tiny is virtually unheard of, and what's more, it has very nice build quality with especially lots of advantages for video work. It has great close focusing ability too, and it's good value for money. On the downside, its tiny design has entailed some optical compromises: softer corners at f2.8, longitudinal chromatic aberration, and bokeh that isn't always convincingly soft. It also does not have its own image stabilization, which will be a disadvantage if your camera doesn't have it built in. At the end of the day though, it's tiny and very useful. It's sharp in the middle of its images with very good contrast, and it's well assembled, and most of all, that low price of only £430 is truly fantastic. It blows away the competition from Sony and Tamron in that way. It makes this lens a viable and affordable upgrade to whatever cheap zoomable kit lens you might currently be using. Bearing that in mind, any optical issues it has are really quite forgivable in my opinion, making it very good value for money, so it certainly does come recommended. You know what else is forgivable? Me plugging my Patreon page at the end of a video, of course, duh. If you find these reviews helpful and you'd like to support the channel while receiving some fun, exclusive content, then check out my Patreon in the description below, and a huge thank you to those generous subscribers who are already supporting. Take care and God bless everyone.